In the quiet Lowcountry region of South Carolina, the Murdaugh family name had been known for generations. For nearly a century, the family held extraordinary power in the local legal system. 3 generations of Murdaugh men had served as powerful prosecutors in the 14th Judicial Circuit, a region that covered several counties across the state. Their influence stretched through law enforcement, the courts, and even local politics. In towns like Hampton and Island Ton, everyone knew the name Murdaugh. To many people in the community, the family represented wealth, power, and prestige. Their law firm handled major civil cases and secured large settlements for clients. Over time, the family built deep relationships with police officers, judges, and local officials. Because of this influence, many residents believed the Murdaugh family had a level of control that few others in the region could match. At the center of this story was Alex Murdaugh, a well-known attorney who had followed in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. Alex worked at the family's prestigious law firm, a business that had been built over decades into one of the most powerful legal institutions in the region. The firm specialized in personal injury cases, often winning large payouts that brought millions of dollars through their offices. From the outside, Alex Murdaugh's life seemed successful. He lived with his wife Maggie Murdaugh and their 2 sons, Buster and Paul, on a massive hunting property known as Moselle. The property covered more than 1,700 acres of land. It included forests, ponds, open fields, and a large network of trails used for hunting and recreation. The Moselle estate was far from the busy streets of nearby towns. Surrounded by thick woods and rural farmland, it offered privacy and quiet. The Murdaugh family often spent weekends there, hunting, riding around the property, or hosting friends. To outsiders, the family looked like the perfect example of Southern success. But behind the appearance of wealth and stability, trouble had already begun building inside the family. Years before the murders that would shock the entire nation, the Murdaugh name had already been connected to several controversial incidents. The most serious of those events occurred in February 2019. On a cold night along the South Carolina coast, a group of young friends gathered for a party. Among them was Paul Murdaugh, the younger son of Alex and Maggie. The group spent the evening drinking and socializing before eventually deciding to take a boat ride across the water. According to investigators, Paul had been drinking heavily that night. Several witnesses later said he was visibly intoxicated and behaving recklessly as he drove the boat through the dark waters near Paris Island. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, tragedy struck. The boat suddenly slammed into a bridge piling at high speed. The violent crash threw several passengers into the freezing water. In the chaos and darkness, one person did not resurface. 19-year-old Mallory Beach had been thrown from the boat during the impact. Emergency responders searched the water for hours. But Mallory was gone. Her body would not be found until several days later. The tragedy devastated her family and quickly became one of the most talked about events in the region. Investigators soon concluded that Paul Murdaugh had likely been driving the boat when it crashed. Evidence suggested that alcohol had played a major role in the accident. The case immediately raised serious questions. Why had someone who was clearly intoxicated been allowed to operate the boat? And would Paul Murdaugh face the same legal consequences as anyone else? As the investigation continued, critics began raising another concern. They believed the powerful Murdaugh family might attempt to influence the legal process. Several people who were present that night later claimed that members of the Murdaugh family appeared at the hospital shortly after the crash. According to those witnesses, there were attempts to shape the narrative about who had been driving the boat. Those allegations quickly spread through the community. The situation became even more controversial when months passed without major legal action. Eventually, Paul Murdaugh was formally charged with multiple felony counts related to boating under the influence resulting in death and serious injury. But the criminal case moved slowly through the court system. Meanwhile, the Beach family filed a civil lawsuit against Alex Murdaugh and his son. That lawsuit would later become an important piece of the larger story. Because during the civil proceedings, attorneys began demanding access to Alex Murdaugh's financial records. And those records contained secrets that Alex had spent years hiding. By early 2021, the pressure on the Murdaugh family had grown intense. Public attention remained focused on the boat crash. Civil lawsuits were moving forward. And questions about the family's influence continued to circulate. But nothing could have prepared the community for what would happen next. On the evening of June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh placed a call to emergency services. The time was approximately 10:07 p.m. The call came from the Moselle property. Alex's voice sounded panicked as he spoke to the dispatcher. "My wife and child have been shot badly," he said. The operator asked him to remain calm and explain what had happened. Alex sounded emotional and out of breath. He told the dispatcher that he had just arrived at the property and discovered the bodies near the dog kennels. Police officers and emergency responders immediately rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they encountered a horrifying sight. Near the dog kennels on the property, 2 bodies lay on the ground. They belonged to Maggie Murdaugh and her son Paul. Both had been brutally murdered. Paul had been shot with a shotgun at extremely close range. The blast had caused devastating injuries. Nearby, Maggie had been shot multiple times with what investigators believed was a high-powered rifle. The violence of the crime shocked even experienced officers. This was not a random accident. It was clearly a double homicide. Investigators quickly secured the area and began collecting evidence. The remote location of the property made the situation even more mysterious. There were no immediate witnesses. No clear suspects. And very little information about what had happened during the moments leading up to the murders. Alex Murdaugh told officers that he had not been home when the shootings occurred. According to his statement, he had left the Moselle property earlier that evening to visit his father, who was seriously ill and staying at a nearby residence. Alex claimed that when he returned to the property later that night, he discovered Maggie and Paul lying near the dog kennels. He said he had immediately called 911. At first, investigators treated Alex as a grieving husband and father. The murders appeared confusing and mysterious. Why would someone target members of such a powerful family? Some people believed the attack might be connected to the 2019 boating accident involving Paul. The theory suggested that someone seeking revenge for Mallory Beach's death might have carried out the killings. Others wondered whether the family's legal work had created enemies over the years. After all, the Murdaugh law firm had handled many high-stakes cases. It was possible that someone with a grudge might have decided to strike back. The case quickly attracted national media attention. News organizations across the United States began covering the story. The idea that members of a powerful legal dynasty had been murdered on their own property fascinated the public. For weeks, the case remained a mystery. But as investigators carefully examined the evidence, certain details began to stand out. Some parts of Alex Murdaugh's story did not seem to match the physical evidence collected at the scene. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of events from that evening. They analyzed phone records. They reviewed digital data. They searched for any surveillance footage that might help them understand what had happened. Slowly, small pieces of information began raising serious questions. One of the most important discoveries came from Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. Just minutes before he was killed, Paul had recorded a short video near the dog kennels. At first, investigators did not think the video would be significant. But when they examined the audio more closely, they noticed something unexpected. A voice could be heard in the background of the recording. Investigators replayed the audio again and again. The voice sounded familiar. It sounded like Alex Murdaugh. This discovery immediately created a serious problem for Alex's story. According to his statement, he had not been at the property during the time of the murders. But if his voice could be heard in the background of the video, that meant he had likely been there only minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. The video quickly became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. But that was only the beginning. Because as detectives continued digging into Alex Murdaugh's personal and financial life, they began uncovering something even more shocking. The respected lawyer who had once been trusted by his entire community was hiding secrets that stretched back for years. Millions of dollars were missing. Clients had been betrayed. And the powerful attorney at the center of the Murdaugh dynasty was living a double life that was about to collapse. Investigators now faced a disturbing possibility. Alex Murdaugh might not have been the victim of this tragedy. He might have been at the center of it. The murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh quickly became one of the most talked about criminal investigations in the United States. In the days following the killings, investigators worked around the clock to understand what had happened on the Moselle property. At first, the case seemed like a mystery. The victims were members of one of the most powerful families in South Carolina. There were no signs of forced entry. No obvious suspects. And the rural location of the property meant there were very few witnesses who might have seen or heard anything unusual that night. Alex Murdaugh, the husband and father who had discovered the bodies, told investigators he had left the Moselle property earlier in the evening to visit his sick father. He repeated the same story several times. According to Alex, he had left Maggie and Paul at the property sometime before 9 o'clock that night. After visiting his father, he claimed he returned home later and found their bodies near the dog kennels. At first, investigators treated him as a grieving family member. But detectives continued examining the timeline. They carefully analyzed phone data, GPS information, and digital records from multiple devices connected to the family. That was when the investigation began to change direction. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. Just minutes before the murders occurred, Paul had recorded a short video at the dog kennels. The video was only a few seconds long, but it contained something extremely important. In the background audio, investigators could hear voices. One of those voices sounded exactly like Alex Murdaugh. For detectives, this discovery raised serious questions. If Alex had truly left the property earlier in the evening, how could his voice be heard in the recording taken moments before the murders? Investigators replayed the video repeatedly, analyzing every sound. The more they listened, the more confident they became. Alex Murdaugh had been at the kennels shortly before Maggie and Paul were killed. This meant his timeline might not be accurate. And if his timeline was wrong, the entire investigation would have to be reconsidered. But the digital evidence was only one part of the puzzle. As detectives continued digging into Alex Murdaugh's life, they discovered something even more troubling. Behind the image of a respected lawyer and powerful family man, Alex was hiding a financial disaster. For years, he had secretly been stealing money. Investigators began uncovering evidence that Alex had taken millions of dollars from clients, settlements, and legal accounts connected to the family law firm. Some of the victims were people who had trusted him during the most difficult moments of their lives. Clients who believed their lawyer was helping them had unknowingly been defrauded. The more investigators examined the financial records, the more shocking the situation became. Millions of dollars had disappeared. The scheme had lasted for years. And Alex Murdaugh had managed to hide it from almost everyone around him. But by the summer of 2021, that secret was beginning to unravel. The civil lawsuit connected to the 2019 boat crash was forcing Alex to reveal his finances. Attorneys representing the Beach family were demanding detailed information about his income and assets. If those records became public, Alex's financial crimes could be exposed. The pressure was growing. And investigators began to wonder if the murders might somehow be connected to those financial problems. At the same time, another event shook the Murdaugh family. Just 3 days after Maggie and Paul were killed, Alex's father, Randolph Murdaugh III, passed away. His death marked the end of another generation of the powerful legal dynasty. But it also meant that Alex had lost one of the most influential figures who might have protected him from growing scrutiny. For the next several months, the murder investigation continued quietly. Authorities did not publicly accuse anyone. But behind the scenes, they were gathering evidence. Then, in September 2021, something happened that shocked the public once again. Alex Murdaugh called 911. This time, he claimed he had been the victim of a shooting. According to Alex, he had been driving along a rural road when his vehicle suddenly experienced a flat tire. He said he pulled over to the side of the road. Moments later, he claimed a passing truck stopped nearby. A man got out of the vehicle. Then Alex said the man pulled out a gun and shot him in the head. The story immediately captured national headlines. A prominent lawyer whose wife and son had recently been murdered was now claiming he had survived an assassination attempt. But as investigators began examining the scene, the story once again raised questions. Alex's injuries were surprisingly minor. Despite claiming he had been shot in the head, the wound appeared to be superficial. Investigators also noticed that several details of the story did not match the physical evidence. The roadside shooting soon became another mystery connected to the Murdaugh family. But this time, the truth would emerge much faster. Only days after the incident, police announced something unexpected. The shooting had not been a random attack. It had been staged. Investigators revealed that Alex Murdaugh had actually arranged the entire event. According to police, Alex had asked a distant relative named Curtis Smith to shoot him. The plan was shocking. Authorities said Alex had hoped the shooting would look like a murder. Because if he died, his surviving son Buster would receive a $10 million life insurance payout. The revelation stunned the public. A respected attorney from one of South Carolina's most powerful families had apparently hired someone to kill him. Soon after this discovery, Alex Murdaugh was arrested. But the charges were not related to the murders of Maggie and Paul. Instead, he was charged with insurance fraud and conspiracy connected to the staged roadside shooting. As investigators continued examining his finances, more charges followed. Dozens of financial crimes were uncovered. Alex was accused of stealing millions of dollars from clients, partners, and legal settlements. The respected lawyer who had once been trusted by his community now faced a growing list of criminal accusations. But one question still remained. Did Alex Murdaugh also murder his wife and son? For months, investigators continued gathering evidence related to the killings at Moselle. They analyzed phone data. They studied ballistics evidence. They reconstructed the timeline of events from the night of June 7th. And slowly, the case against Alex Murdaugh began to take shape. Then, more than a year after the murders, authorities made a dramatic announcement. In July 2022, Alex Murdaugh was formally charged with the murders of Maggie and Paul. Prosecutors believed the evidence would show that Alex had been present at the kennels shortly before the killings. They believed his story about leaving the property had been false. And they believed the murders were connected to the financial crimes that were about to be exposed. The once powerful lawyer now faced the most serious accusation imaginable. He was charged with murdering members of his own family. The case would soon move toward trial. And when the courtroom proceedings finally began, the entire nation would watch closely. Because what prosecutors were about to reveal would expose the full collapse of the Murdaugh dynasty. The case against Alex Murdaugh slowly built over more than a year. Investigators gathered phone records, financial documents, forensic evidence, and witness statements. By the time prosecutors were ready to bring the case to trial, the story had already captured national attention. In July 2022, Alex Murdaugh was officially charged with the murders of his wife Maggie and his son Paul. For many people, the idea seemed almost impossible to believe. How could a father murder his own family? But prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to prove exactly that. The trial began in January 2023 in Colleton County, South Carolina. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across the country traveled to cover the proceedings. Cameras lined the streets outside the courthouse. Inside, members of the community filled the benches, eager to see how the case would unfold. For decades, the Murdaugh family had been the ones standing inside courtrooms as powerful prosecutors. Now, one of them sat at the defense table as a murder defendant. Alex Murdaugh appeared in court wearing a suit and glasses, often looking tired and emotional. His once powerful image had completely changed. The prosecution began by outlining their theory of the crime. They argued that Alex Murdaugh had been facing enormous pressure in the months leading up to the murders. His financial crimes were close to being exposed. The lawsuit related to the boat crash threatened to reveal years of stolen money. His reputation, career, and freedom were all at risk. According to prosecutors, Alex believed that a shocking tragedy might create sympathy and delay the investigations into his finances. They argued that the murders of Maggie and Paul were meant to distract attention from the financial scandals that were about to surface. The prosecution then began presenting evidence. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the cell phone video recorded by Paul Murdaugh shortly before his death. In the video, Paul was standing near the dog kennels at the Moselle property. The clip itself seemed ordinary. But the audio contained a crucial detail. Investigators played the recording in court. Several voices could be heard in the background. Witnesses who knew the family testified that one of those voices clearly belonged to Alex Murdaugh. This discovery directly contradicted Alex's earlier statements to police. He had repeatedly claimed that he was not at the kennels before the murders. But the video suggested he had been there just minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. The prosecution argued that this proved Alex had lied about his timeline. And if he had lied about something so important, it raised serious questions about everything else he had said. The courtroom remained silent as the recording was played. Many people believed this moment could determine the outcome of the trial. But the prosecution had more evidence. Investigators presented phone data showing the movements of Alex, Maggie, and Paul on the night of the murders. The records revealed activity on Alex's phone shortly after the time prosecutors believed the murders occurred. According to their analysis, Alex began moving quickly around the property shortly after Maggie and Paul's phones stopped responding. Prosecutors argued that this behavior suggested someone attempting to create an alibi. Then the trial turned to Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes. At first, the defense had tried to prevent this information from being included in the trial. They argued that the financial issues were unrelated to the murders. But the judge allowed the evidence. Prosecutors explained to the jury that Alex had stolen millions of dollars from clients over many years. Some victims had lost money that was meant to support them after serious injuries or tragedies. The prosecution argued that Alex's financial situation was collapsing. The pressure from lawsuits and investigations was growing stronger every day. They believed Alex feared that everything he had built would soon be destroyed. According to their theory, the murders were a desperate attempt to delay the exposure of his crimes. The defense team fought back against these claims. Alex's lawyers argued that the prosecution had no direct evidence connecting him to the murders. There were no eyewitnesses. The murder weapons had not been found. And the crime scene contained many unanswered questions. They also argued that the investigation had been influenced by public pressure and media attention. According to the defense, Alex was simply a man who had made serious financial mistakes but had not committed murder. They suggested that someone else might have been responsible for the killings. Perhaps someone seeking revenge for the boat crash involving Paul. Perhaps someone angry about one of the family's legal cases. The defense also focused on Alex's emotional behavior after the murders. They pointed out that he had called 911 immediately and had cooperated with investigators. Throughout the trial, Alex often appeared emotional, sometimes wiping away tears while listening to testimony about his wife and son. Then, in a surprising decision, Alex Murdaugh took the witness stand in his own defense. It was a risky move. Defendants in murder trials rarely testify because they can be cross-examined by prosecutors. But Alex insisted on telling his side of the story. During his testimony, Alex admitted something important. He acknowledged that he had lied to investigators about being at the dog kennels before the murders. He said he had been there with Maggie and Paul earlier that evening. According to Alex, he lied because he was paranoid and afraid that investigators might suspect him. He also admitted to years of financial crimes. He told the court that he had stolen money from clients and struggled with a long addiction to opioid painkillers. But despite those admissions, Alex strongly denied committing the murders. He insisted that he loved his wife and son and would never harm them. The prosecution then began their cross-examination. The questioning was intense. Prosecutors challenged Alex about his lies, his financial crimes, and the inconsistencies in his timeline. They asked him why he had repeatedly told police he was not at the kennels. Alex responded that he had panicked and made a terrible decision. But prosecutors suggested something far more serious. They argued that he had lied because he knew he had been at the scene when the murders occurred. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its final stage. Both sides delivered closing arguments to the jury. The prosecution told jurors that the case was about accountability. They argued that Alex Murdaugh had spent his entire life using his family's power to escape consequences. But now, they said, the truth had finally caught up with him. The defense urged jurors to focus on the lack of direct evidence. They argued that suspicion was not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After closing arguments ended, the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. The entire country waited for the verdict. News stations broadcast updates throughout the day. Legal experts debated the strength of the evidence. But the jury did not deliberate for long. After less than 3 hours, they reached a decision. On March 2, 2023, Alex Murdaugh returned to the courtroom to hear the verdict. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand. One by one, the verdicts were read aloud. Guilty. 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 Alex Murdaugh was convicted of the murders of Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Members of the victims' families quietly cried. The once powerful lawyer sat silently as the reality of the verdict settled in. The following day, the judge delivered the sentence. Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke directly to Alex before announcing the punishment. He acknowledged the long history of the Murdaugh family in the region but said the evidence clearly showed Alex had committed terrible crimes. With that sentence, the century-long dominance of the Murdaugh legal dynasty came to an end. The family that had once controlled courtrooms across the region had fallen in the most dramatic way imaginable. But even after the verdict, the story continued. Alex Murdaugh still faced dozens of additional charges related to his financial crimes. Investigators continued examining the massive fraud scheme that had stolen millions of dollars from clients. The case also sparked wider conversations about power, privilege, and corruption in the American legal system. Many people questioned how Alex had been able to hide his crimes for so many years. Others wondered whether the influence of the Murdaugh family had protected him from scrutiny in the past. For the community of South Carolina's Lowcountry, the case left a deep mark. A powerful family had been destroyed. A mother and son had lost their lives. And a man who once held immense respect had become one of the most infamous criminals in the country. The story of the Murdaugh family would be remembered for years to come. It was a story about power, secrets, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. And it all began on a quiet night in June 2021, at a remote property called Moselle.